and welcome to Musicology for the People. I'm your host, Allison Kaufman, and today I thought I would answer a question that I've actually, believe it or not, been asked twice this week. What is the difference between a violin and a fiddle? Short answer? Not a gosh darn thing. When people refer to a violin or a fiddle, they're typically referring to the wooden box that is hollow and has the curly part at the end of it. Whether it's a violin or a fiddle, it's gonna be the same thing. The differences between a violin and a fiddle are what we call the setup, or the added-on parts. Most fiddles and violins are set up with 4 strings. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and there have been many a 5-string fiddle. If you're talking about the violins and fiddles used for most of Western music, it's gonna have 4 strings. The strings themselves, however, can be different. Historically, the strings used on a violin are something called catgut. Traditionally, catgut strings were made from the intestines of animals, usually sheep. Now, however, catgut strings are usually a synthetic material with a very fine metal wrapped around it. Fiddlers typically use steel strings. Now, as you can imagine on both fronts, metal is just not as forgiving as catguts. In the old days, when gut strings were used, musicians typically tuned their instruments only with the wooden pegs on the curly end of the instrument. However, metal strings were constantly breaking from the clumsy stress of a peg tuner. Then came the invention of the fine tuners, which you see on the tailpiece of the instrument. For a while, everyone used fine tuners. It was a happy-go-lucky fine-tuning day. But then a stereotype arose that only bad musicians used fine tuners. Since violinists didn't want to be associated with bad musicians, they began to stick their nose up at using fine tuners and said that only fiddlers used fine tuners. Fiddlers, of course, didn't really care either way, and they were really useful, so they just used them. However, that stereotype's kind of gone down in the last 10 years, and many a fine classical violinist uses fine tuners, especially on the very difficult to tune E string. And for that matter, there are some fiddlers that don't use tuners, so meh. The next difference is the bridge. The bridge is a small piece of wood that holds the strings up from the body of the instrument. Bridges come in varying degrees of straight to curved. When a bridge is more straight, it puts the strings at a more even level. But when a bridge is curved, it makes it so the strings are a little bit separated from each other at angles. In general, fiddlers will use a flatter bridge because it makes it easier to play chords or 2 or 3 notes at the same time. Violinists, on the other hand, prefer a more arched bridge as it makes it easier to play one beautiful melody without possibly contaminating the sound with an accidental bump from another string. Another difference is the chin rest. It is very difficult to find a performance of a professional or even amateur violinist that is not using a chin rest on it. This is because proper violin technique means that you're supposed to hold the violin between your chin and your neck. Holding a violin or fiddle in that place makes it very difficult to talk, let alone sing at the same time that you're playing. Many fiddlers, for example, are required to call out dance moves while they're playing. Therefore, many fiddlers eschew the chin rest in favor of a different form of playing, usually lower on their arm or shoulder hold as it's called. While what I've just presented to you is the typical way to determine whether something is a fiddle or a violin, it really is impossible to tell. The two have the same body after all, so what does it really matter? It just depends what's being played on it. For example, I had a good friend in high school who played both violin and fiddle on the same instrument, and she was amazing at both. In fact, in one of her recitals, she played music for both the fiddle and the violin. And the only difference in the performance, other than of course the style of the piece, was that for fiddle music, she would just take her shoes off. Well, I hope you learned something today, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe. Also check out the Facebook and Twitter accounts that are associated with this channel where I post other fun things throughout the week. Until next Tuesday, can't we all just get along? Musicology.